Hello and welcome to week 3, which is week 4. So we'll call it week 4 of history. We're going to make that extra one up at some point here. Don't worry, guys. Um, we have basically 3 very distinct lessons in this week's material. Lesson 7, 8, and 9 are about 3 very different things. Let me read you the note to the teacher that the textbook has. Quote, I recommend previewing this lesson, this first one here, to determine which parts are suitable for your children. The more graphic paragraphs are marked and may be skipped without losing the gist of the story. This is the first one, the Siege of Masada, is a very, very sad story. You are allowed to have, of course, any feelings, any reaction you have are, valid in their own way. But this is a pretty grim story. There's also a little bit of heroism in here. Again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. What is significant about Masada is not only what happened, there was an awful lot certainly memorable that happened here, but this represented the last Jewish defiance of Rome. In the year 70, you'll recall the Temple of Jerusalem was sacked by Roman soldiers at the end of the Great Jewish Revolt. The Romans decided they had finally had enough of this little corner of their empire that wouldn't behave, and so they sent, I think Josephus told us something on the order of 20,000 troops who breached the walls of Jerusalem and just destroyed the city, destroyed the temple almost brick by brick. They paraded the objects that they had stolen from the temple throughout the streets. Lots of the Jews were arrested and taken into servitude throughout the Roman Empire. It was another Jewish diaspora, another scattering of the Jewish people. Terrible, terrible story. But there was one group of Jews who listened to Josephus. Remember our guy Josephus last week? He warned the Jews not to mess with the Romans. He'd been in Rome. He had seen their army. He had seen what they were capable of. And he told them, accurately, that there is absolutely no way we can beat these guys if they decide to wage total war against us. This group came to be known as the Zealots. Rather than fight Rome directly, they fled. And they fled to a place called Masada. Masada was a temple, fortress that had been built many years earlier by King Herod. Yes, that King Herod, the one who the second King Herod, the one that sent the wise men to find baby Jesus. Herod was, like so many of the other leaders, very, very paranoid, and he wanted to have basically an escape fortress in case he needed to escape and had a place to defend himself. So this raised piece of ground near the Red Sea, next to some deep ravines, jutted out conspicuously, and it had a flat plateau, ideal for building a fortress, and that's exactly what he did. It was a stronghold. If you are fans of Lord of the Rings and you remember Helm's Deep, it was built specifically with defense in mind. Masada was built specifically with defense in mind. He stored many years' worth of rainwater there. He had installed a series of cisterns that collected all the rainwater they possibly could. And of course, in a dry climate like this, rainwater, every drop was precious. So they had years' worth of rainwater there that they had collected. They had storehouses of preserved food. So not only were they well provisioned, they were well defensed. There were only 2 really ways up to get to Masada, and both of them were very treacherous paths that a single person could walk, or a small group of people, but an army? Especially when you're trying to walk up these paths, and there are people 800 feet in front of you pelting you with rocks and tar and pitch. Anyway, the Romans found that there were about 960 or so, almost 1,000 zealots that lived at Masada and were not only fleeing Rome, but defying Rome. Word got back to Emperor Vespasian about them, and evidently he could not tolerate even this one little holdout of Jewish defiance. So he sent, according to Josephus, 20,000 Roman soldiers, about the same number that they used to sack Jerusalem, to attack Masada and to end this insolent rebellion. The Romans quickly learned that Masada was indeed impenetrable. They tried and tried, and again, like we said, every time they tried to get up the side of the hills, the people who were defending Masada did their job and pelted them and kept them at bay. And of course, you're talking about a siege where you starve them out and you surround them. They knew that the people of Masada had several years of food, probably even more. And did you want to commit 20,000 of your soldiers to sit there waiting for 10 years for these people to starve out? No. So they had to find a way up there, but there was no way based upon the current geography. Someone got the idea, though, of building a ramp. Like here's Masada. Just build a dirt ramp over here. Just keep piling it up, building it up. They brought in thousands of slaves to build this dirt ramp right up to the side of Masada. It took about 7 months for this process. I mean, it's very labor intensive. And you can only imagine what the people of Masada are saying as this army builds this ramp to basically get right onto their front door. I mean, for 7 months, you see that ramp getting higher and higher and closer, and you know what's going to come next. Very slow progression. At the very top of this ramp, once they got up there, they put up a large structure that included a battering ram. This is part of the Roman siege equipment. And of course, the battering ram did what a battering ram did. Once they had it in place, it busted down the wall. The Jews erected a very hastily constructed wooden wall after that, but the Romans set it on fire. And it was late in the day, evidently, as this video I'm showing you tells. So they decided to go the next day and finish the job. Throughout the night, though, 960 women, men, children died by their own hands. Rather than face Roman rule, imprisonment, slavery, they chose death. 2 older women and 5 children survived this mass suicide somehow or another and explained what happened. They knew that if they were taken alive, they would be tormented as prisoners, and this way they could die as free people. The father of the families was in charge of taking care of his families in terms of killing them. And then they drew lots, sort of a macabre little tournament here to have one kill the other and kill the other until the last one took his own life, evidently. There's no words to describe this beyond sad. I mean, well, there are many other emotions you could have. The Romans won, obviously. The last bit of Jewish resistance was gone. But what do we say about martyrs? Martyrs live on long past their lives. Instead of having 1 or 2 martyrs here, you got 960 of them. And their defiance is still felt today. Today, the Jewish army that uses the ruins of Masada as the place where Israel's soldiers go and swear their allegiance to Israel. They take their oath to Israel at the Masada. In Israel, postage stamps, medallions, signs, all say the words, Masada shall not fall again. And so 960 martyrs, no other way to put it, had an incredible positive impact on keeping the spirit of the Jewish people alive through their diaspora, through their displacement. Even though they had no home, they had the memory of the martyrs of Masada. Lesson number 8 talks about something that actually happened, it was formed a little bit before Masada. Masada was 75 A.D. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls took us back to probably 100, maybe even further BC, before Christ. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the name given to hundreds of well-preserved copies of Scripture that were written thousands of years ago, found only in the last century. It was 1947 when, again, this sounds like a movie, a little shepherd boy is working in the Qumran region near the Dead Sea, and he's farting around throwing a rock into a cave, and he heard something break, but it didn't sound like rock on rock. It sounded like rock on clay, because it sounded like a jar shattering, almost glass-like. He went in and he saw a bunch of clay jars, and when he opened them up, they contained papyrus scrolls. What he found were written fragments, that is, of the Old Testament, representing pieces of every book of the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. Esther is kind of I don't want to say an add-on to the Old Testament, but if trivia time, Esther is the only book of the Bible in which God is not mentioned. He's implied, but not mentioned specifically. Anyway, you might win a bet or two that knowing that. Over time, and again, this is fairly recent, 1947, not even a century ago. Over time, over the next few decades, they found 10 more caves in that area where hundreds of more scrolls were uncovered, including parts of the Apocrypha. That's one word I want you to remember, the Apocrypha. These were the records of people who wrote these documents, the Maccabees and all. Sometimes they're called the hidden books of the Bible. Some versions of the Catholic Bible do include these parts of the Apocrypha. But your standard Protestant Bibles do not. The Book of Maccabees, and there's a few others there. Next question is, who wrote the Dead Scrolls? Well, that was a topic for many, many years among historians, and really it was just, not even 10 years ago when we found pretty solid evidence that it was the Essenes, Essenes, the Essenes, who wrote them. They were a group of very strict Jews. They were so strict that they did not believe they could keep the law of Moses while living in society among lots of other people, unless they were like them, very observant. So they went out into caves, out into the wilderness, and formed societies. Societies with voluntary participation, where wealth and food were all shared, but they all were committed to the idea of keeping the law, Moses' law, God's law, in a setting that would make it possible. They didn't feel it was possible to live around people who were not doing as well as they were to keep the law. About 200 to 400 people, evidently in the Essenes. They were fairly well off, evidently. The main occupation, in addition to all the sustaining things, farming and tanning and all that, seems to have been preserving the scriptures against weather for people to come 2,000 years later and still find them. It's an amazing achievement because of the way they were stored and some of the substances that were used. These scrolls were very well preserved. The dry weather helped out an awful lot too. Moisture is the enemy of paper and papyrus, Being in that climate around the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea, if you don't know, that is the lowest point on Earth. It's like 300 feet below sea level. That means it's lower than the Mediterranean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. It's the lowest point on Earth, and there's so many mineral deposits in the water that fish can't survive it. That's why it's the Dead Seas. No fish in there. As a matter of fact, if you jumped into the Dead Sea water, you would float because of all the minerals. I mean, it's the weirdest water in the world. But that helped this dry climate around here to keep this calf skin, the sheep skin that some of them were written on, the parchment and papyrus, just keep them remarkably well preserved, as you see in some of these pictures here. These 2,000-year-old documents probably look like as well preserved as, say, a 100-year-old document you might find in your home's attic or your grandma's place. Mostly written in Hebrew. There was some Aramaic in Greece. Aramaic, of course, the language of the time. Those who were well-educated probably wrote theirs down in Greek. That was considered a second language for those who were learned. And really today, 2021, this is still really being pieced together, almost like a big jigsaw puzzle. Scholars, again, pieces here, pieces there. What does this mean? One thing, though, as we Of course, I mean, we already had the Bible in 1947 when this came along. And so the discovery of this started getting people thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to change what's in the Bible? It was a real concern. I mean, these were obviously some early transcripts of everything. And the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, a lot of it was just, the passed down Jewish oral tradition. These stories were told to each other, told, and finally somebody decided to write them down for all time. And it was a question as to whether, I think the earliest written texts that we could go back to in the Bible and say, okay, this book of Exodus was from here. About 400 or 500. The Masoretes in that region wrote those down. So these documents, Dead Sea Scrolls, are several centuries before these. What if there's a major contradiction here? I mean, the foundation of Judaism and Christianity and even Islam would be impacted. Well, a remarkable thing happened. The Dead Sea Scrolls were pretty dadgum accurate as far as, or I should say the Masoretic texts, which we used, or everybody used for the Old Testament, was pretty doggone accurate. One study said, quote, even though the two copies of Isaiah discovered in the Qumran cave near the Dead Sea in 1947 were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscript previously known, around 980 AD, they proved to be word for word identical with the standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted mainly of obvious slips of the pen, variations in spelling for time and whatnot. There's no way that's a coincidence. It cannot be a coincidence. It certainly underscores the authority of the Old Testament as the authentic Word of God, the stories of God, of course, and the stories of His people. The Dead Sea Scrolls went immediately from possibly undermining the three largest religions in the world to pretty much corroborating everything they were about. Again, this is all Old Testament stuff here. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, and again, we're still putting pieces together, still learning, but the obvious conclusion is that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm what we've known in the Old Testament for centuries and centuries. The ninth lesson is another event. And it happened 4 years after Masada. It has nothing to do with Masada. It is a story that's, we've told, and it's kind of become, a part of modern pop culture in a almost a tongue-in-cheek way. The city of Pompeii in AD 79, of course, Mount Vesuvius erupts, buries the city in ash, and it remains buried for nearly 1,500 years. Now, we say that, and of course, we know it in our culture, but it's remarkable to think about what happened. I'm not going to begin to say I can explain all of the geological things that happened that made this volcano eruption so spectacular. There's two elements that make it different. Number one, the scientific nature of exactly what happened here. This was not your ordinary volcanic eruption, and we'll go into why. But also, because of its impact, it destroyed one of the 10 top cities of the world at that point, certainly top 20. Pompeii was a port city in Italy, not far from Rome. Matter of fact, a lot of the goods that ended up in Rome probably came in through Pompeii. About 20,000 people. Again, for today, that's half the size of Danville, but for its time, 20,000 was a good-sized city. And by all accounts, it was a thriving city. One of the things they found in the ruins, and we'll get to that in a second, were political signs. Evidently, when the volcano struck on August 24th, they were getting ready to have an election. And just like we see this year with the governor's race and all, there were election signs in people's yards. You know, vote for him or don't vote for him. And they were having an election. They found lots of political signs in the ruins there. But over the course of 36 hours, this thriving city was obliterated. A few years earlier, there was a massive earthquake that rocked the town. Maybe a couple of people killed. Bad thing, obviously, but nothing, to think about otherwise. But now we know today that earthquakes are near volcanoes are almost a certain bet that the volcano is going to roll here very, very soon. We're armed with that modern knowledge. The people of Pompeii were not. Again, the mountain of Vesuvius, where the mount was green and lush, provided vegetation. There were people who lived on it. I mean, it was a mountain, very steep, but it was a living mountain, very lush. We understand. There were creeks and streams all up and down it. Kind of like the mountains here, really. Tourist spots, camping, whatnot. The evidence suggested that the last time Vesuvius had erupted was maybe 2,000 years ago. So really, in the knowledge of these people, there was never a time that Pompeii was not just this pretty mountain, that Vesuvius, I should say, was not this beautiful mountain that overlooked Pompeii. Nobody knew it was coming. And when it came, there was some questions as to what was going on. Why? Because this was an unusual explosion. Trying to explain it here, I tried to find some good visual aids to explain what happened, but none of them really did it justice. Usually when a volcano explodes, again, the magma under the earth, the molten earth, releases gases, and finally it reaches the breaking point, and it has to go somewhere, and it goes up through the earth into a volcano. And where it's gone before, it's going to go again. Evidently, this mountain was formed with a volcano. When that happens, it's going to go up again. Usually what happens is the top of the mountain blows off and lava comes down the side, rains down ash and whatever. For whatever reason, and the experts say this happens about 1 in 1,000 times with a volcano eruption, the amount of gases that came out of Vesuvius was so strong, like a fan on steroids, that it did blow off the top of the mountain, a lot of land. But the pressure from this was so strong, it kept the mountain, that top of the mountain that it ripped open, it kept it suspended in midair while the gas kept coming out. Imagine a fan blowing a piece of paper up and keeping it up in the air. If you can imagine that, something like that. When they heard it, of course, they heard it and felt it, and, that was not a mystery. But they looked out and they saw this purplish red sky just hanging above with ash falling down, and the ash was just starting to come down at that point, and a lot of people just looked at it going, geez, what is that? Some people made the right call and got the heck out of Dodge. The geologists think that this pressure blew the top of the mountain 21 miles into the air. 100,000 feet. That's higher than planes flying. If you fly a plane at 100,000 feet, radar can't get you. That's way on up there. And it kept it up there for hours and hours and hours. One description was this: it was not clear at the distance from which mountain the cloud was rising. Its general appearance can best be expressed as like being an umbrella, for it rose to a great height on a sort of trunk and then split off into branches. I imagine because it was thrust upwards by the first blast and then left unsupported as the pressure subsided, or else it would have borne down by its own weight so that it spread out and gradually dispersed. Well, that red cloud hovered over Vesuvius like a giant mushroom for hours and hours. A lot of people had time to escape. Once they figured out, okay, I believe this is going to be very bad very quickly, thousands left by boat, on foot, on horseback, but the ash started falling and it started picking up steam. the rate of 6 inches an hour. If you get 6 inches an hour of snow, that's epic. You get 6 inches an hour of ash, and it doesn't stop for many hours. Yeah. What ultimately destroyed the region and really took the lives of thousands was the hot air and gases that escaped there, too. They were toxic. After about 11 hours, the pressure of the volcanoes began to weaken. And as it cooled, that great column of ash on the rock that was hanging up in the air collapsed. 6 different times the column surged downward, and large chunks just ripped through buildings and destroyed them. Like a hurricane of earth, if you can imagine that. At the end, 12 feet of ash buried the city of Pompeii. The harbor very quickly became useless because there was so much ash that the water just turned to mush. You couldn't get through it. The oddest thing came 1,500 years later when we started, or archaeologists started, to uncover the ruins of Pompeii. Because of the amount of the ash that fell, and there really wasn't a lot of hot lava that came through and ripped in afterwards, so it didn't mess up anything. People were like frozen in time. I'll show you some pictures here of some of the images we have. They basically had these cavities in the earth, and when they put plaster in there and took them out, just remarkable detail of the final position of some of these people and how suddenly they were overcome with ash and, of course, with gas. Gas probably knocked them out, and then the ash covered them. There was a bakery found with bread still in the oven. Some people were found clutching the arms of their loved ones. It's hard to believe a city could remain covered like that for 1,500 years, and even more remarkable that hundreds of years later we could find this kind of detail. Today, the city of Pompeii has been covered. They've basically, if you can call it that, vacuumed up 12 feet of ash and everything else, and they've left the city kind of as it appeared in that day. You can visit there today. People do all the time. Archaeologists have discovered ways to preserve the ash-covered bodies. They've even been able to use those election signs we were talking about to trace the families back to Pompeii. What does this have to do with world history? Well, or early church history, especially since the Romans were the bad guys, so to speak. Well, a lot of what we have in Western thought and law, and really remnants of our modern day culture, had to do with the Roman Empire. Yes, it was brutal. Yes, it was not kind at all to Jews, but it was a titan in the way we think. It is why Western history is distinct from Eastern history, African history. It is distinct, and it is the antecedent, the direct antecedent of what we call Western civilization today. Also, just on a more spiritual level, I guess, it's a sobering reminder of the uncertainty of life. Vesuvius, still an active volcano. It is monitored every day. But again, with technology, we have much better ways of figuring out well before volcanic eruptions. But it is a sobering reminder that life is precious, that life is not promised to us. It's a spectacular story, and it was one of the events that helped shape the Roman Empire. Again, the uncertainty of Pompeii was something that the Romans remembered for some time. Again, I hope the visual aids will help you a little bit, and hopefully we'll have some decent discussion on some hard questions come Monday. We'll see you on Monday.